What if I told you that somewhere in the muddy fields of France, beneath the rusted remains of forgotten helmets and bones, lies the story of a man who changed the course of history, yet no one remembers his name? Would you believe that one soldier, born from the working class streets of London, carried a secret that could have rewritten the outcome of the First World War? But his courage was buried under silence, betrayal, and blood. Before we dive into this haunting chapter of real history, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this story, because what you're about to hear is not just a tale of war. It's the truth that history tried to forget. The year was 1916. Europe was burning. The trenches of the Somme stretched like open wounds across the French countryside. Rain turned the earth into sludge and rats fed on the dead, Tom. But amid the chaos, among the nameless thousands who lived and died for their empire, one soldier stood apart, Private Thomas Keating of the British 36th Ulster Division. Thomas was not born a hero. He was a dockworker's son from East London, rough, stubborn, and fiercely loyal to his mother. When war broke out in 1914, he lied about his age to enlist. He was only 17. He wanted glory, like the posters promised. Join the army, see the world. But what he saw instead was a world drowning in smoke, screams, and mud. By the summer of 1916, the Battle of the Somme was at its deadliest. The British Army had already lost 60,000 men on the first day alone. Still, the generals ordered another assault. Thomas's unit received the command, advance at dawn. That night, as he cleaned his rifle under the faint glow of a trench lantern, Thomas overheard two officers arguing quietly near the command post. Their voices trembled not from fear, but from guilt. He caught fragments of words. French position collapsing. Intelligence reports wrong. We're sending them to slaughter. Thomas froze. He wasn't supposed to hear that. The plan was flawed. The Germans had reinforced the very sector they were supposed to attack. By morning, hundreds of his comrades would be dead. He faced a choice no soldier should ever face: obey his orders and lead his friends to death, or defy command and try to save them an act that could mean execution for treason. That night, he didn't sleep. He looked at the faces of the men around him. Boys, really some singing softly, others writing letters they'd never send. Thomas clenched his fists and whispered to himself, "If history's written by generals, then I write mine in blood." At dawn, the whistles blew. The men climbed over the parapet, bayonets glinting through the fog. The moment their boots hit the mud, machine guns opened fire. Shells screamed overhead. Thomas saw his closest friend, Jimmy Clark, torn apart before taking 3 steps. He couldn't take it. He shouted, "Fall back! Take cover!" But the others couldn't hear. The thunder of war drowned everything. In a split-second decision, Thomas ran through the bullets toward the signal line, tearing through the communications trench. He broke open the field telephone and screamed into it, "Abort the attack! Sector D is compromised!" The operator on the other end stuttered. "Who is this? Identify yourself." But before Thomas could answer, an explosion threw him backward, and the world went black. When he woke, he was in a field hospital, both legs wrapped in bandages, his ears ringing. A nurse whispered, "You're lucky to be alive, soldier." But the look on her face told him something was wrong. 2 days later, he was arrested. His commanding officer accused him of mutiny and insubordination. The order he gave to abort the attack had reached the wrong channel. And because of that message, a nearby regiment had held their advance, causing confusion and what the generals called a loss of momentum. They blamed him for the failure of an entire operation. Thomas tried to explain. He told them about the overheard conversation, the false intelligence, the massacre that would have happened, but the officers denied everything. The report vanished. The names of the 2 officers he overheard were never recorded. He was court-martialed in secret without witnesses. No one from his unit was allowed to testify. The verdict: guilty. Sentence: death by firing squad. But fate had other plans. On the night before his execution, a German artillery shell struck the prison compound. The walls collapsed, chaos erupted, and in the smoke and confusion, Thomas Keating escaped. He crawled through the rubble, half blind and bleeding, into the no-man's land that separated the living from the damned. He wasn't seen again for months. Yet in the winter of 1917, strange things began happening on the Western Front. German supply lines were sabotaged. Officers reported anonymous warnings that saved entire battalions from ambush. Encrypted German messages mysteriously reached the British command before the enemy even moved. Rumors spread among soldiers. A ghost roamed the trenches, a man who fought for no flag, who appeared in the night to save lives and vanished before dawn. They called him the Red Ghost. Only a few knew the truth. The ghost was no myth. It was Thomas Keating. They said the Red Ghost walked through smoke without a sound, that he appeared before shellfire, as if he could sense death before it came. To the Germans, he was a curse whispered in fear. To the British, a miracle wrapped in mystery. In truth, Thomas Keating had not died in the blast. He had been reborn. Wounded, disillusioned, and branded a traitor, he no longer fought for a king or country. He fought for the men who had no names, for the ones buried without glory. After his escape, Thomas was found half dead by a French nurse named Clara Duval, a widow who had lost her husband in Verdun. She hid him in a barn near the ruins of her village, dressing his wounds with torn sheets. When he awoke, she said softly, "You're English, but your eyes, they don't see like a soldier anymore." He told her the truth, every word of it. How he'd been betrayed, how his command had sent hundreds to die, and how they tried to erase him to protect their own pride. Clara listened in silence, tears tracing down her soot-covered face. Then she said something that would change everything. Maybe the world needs ghosts to remind it that the living are still human. For the next few months, Thomas stayed hidden in that shattered corner of France. But he couldn't stay idle. He began helping French partisans sabotage German supply convoys, using his training to reroute munitions, destroy bridges, and intercept radio signals. Clara helped him send coded messages to the Allied side, messages signed only with a blood-red mark, a handprint pressed onto the paper. That mark soon became infamous. British intelligence started receiving anonymous reports. Accurate, precise, impossible. The source was unknown, but every message bore the same seal, a red hand. When one of those messages prevented a massacre at the town of Bapaume, the British command grew desperate to uncover who was behind them. Colonel Frederick Stanton of the Secret Intelligence Service was assigned to find this red ghost. He followed the trail across ruined villages and forests scarred by war. Everywhere he went, locals spoke of a man who fought alone, who struck German patrols in the dark, who vanished like smoke. Finally, in the spring of 1917, Stanton's unit ambushed a German convoy near the Somme, and there, among the chaos and gunfire, he saw him, a figure in tattered British uniform, his face hidden under a mud-streaked scarf, charging through the smoke with a revolver blazing. When the dust settled, Stanton shouted, "Hold fire, don't shoot!" The stranger froze. Stanton stepped closer, and their eyes met, eyes he recognized from a court-martial report he'd signed a year earlier. "Keating," he whispered. "You're supposed to be dead." Thomas stared back. "Dead men don't bleed, Colonel." Instead of arresting him, Stanton made a choice that defied every rule of war. He offered Thomas a deal. "Work for me. Off the books, no uniform, no record. You'll go where soldiers can't behind enemy lines. You'll feed us what the generals don't want us to know." Thomas agreed, on one condition. "No more lies. If I risk my life, the truth gets told." And so began one of the most secret operations of the First World War, an operation that never appeared in official British archives because it wasn't meant to. Thomas became a ghost not just to the Germans, but to history itself. Disguised as a deserter, he infiltrated German lines near Arras, posing as a mercenary, offering information to the Kaiser's army. He learned their troop movements, their plans for the next gas attack, even their secret project to develop longer-range artillery. He smuggled this information to the Allies through Clara's network, often by writing invisible ink letters that she would hide inside hymn books. Once, he spent 6 days buried under a collapsed cellar with only a candle and his pistol, waiting for a German patrol to pass. When he finally emerged, he found Clara's cottage destroyed. The red ghost was alone again, but he kept moving. Each act of sabotage, each message, each life saved, it was his revenge against the system that betrayed him. And yet, with every passing month, he felt the line between right and wrong blur. He was saving men, yes, but he was also killing, lying, becoming the very thing he once despised. In 1918, as the war neared its brutal climax, Thomas intercepted something extraordinary. A coded document carried by a German officer killed near Saint-Quentin. It wasn't a battle plan. It was correspondence between British and German diplomats, discussing a potential secret ceasefire negotiation, a deal that could end the war early, but only if certain political figures were preserved from scandal. Thomas realized with horror that the same officers who had sentenced him to death were now trying to negotiate peace, while soldiers were still dying by the thousands. He had proof that could destroy the reputations of men in London's highest offices. That night he wrote one final letter, not to Clara, not to Stanton, but to the people. He described everything: the false intelligence, the betrayal, the deals made over dead men's bodies. He ended the letter with 7 words. "History is written in ink and blood." He placed his red handprint on the page, sealed it inside a tin ammunition box, and buried it beneath a shattered oak tree near Saint-Quentin. Days later, as the Germans retreated and the British advanced, Thomas Keating disappeared in the smoke of battle. Some said he was killed by artillery fire. Others swore they saw him walking east toward the dawn with his rifle slung over his shoulder. When the war ended months later, no record of Thomas Keating was ever found. The British War Office erased his name from every file. Colonel Stanton retired quietly, refusing to speak of the Red Ghost. But in 1934, French farmers uncovered a rusted ammunition box while plowing the fields of Saint-Quentin. Inside were papers so brittle they crumbled to dust, and a single red handprint, still visible after nearly 2 decades. The story was never published. The documents were seized by the British government for national security. Only whispers remained. And yet, on the walls of a war museum in London, there hangs a faded, blood-stained handkerchief labeled simply, "Recovered from the Somme, 1916, donor unknown." Some say that handprint belongs to the Red Ghost, the soldier who wrote history in blood. Winter fell over France like a shroud. The trenches that once shook with artillery now stood silent, frozen ghosts of a war that had devoured an entire generation. The Red Ghost, if he still lived, was nowhere to be found. Years passed. The world moved on. New borders were drawn, new flags raised, and the men who sent others to die were now sitting in Parliament, their medals polished and speeches prepared. But some ghosts refused to rest. In 1923, Colonel Frederick Stanton, the man who had once recruited Thomas Keating, received a letter postmarked from Calais. Inside was a single photograph, a group of orphans standing in front of a small schoolhouse. At the back stood a man in a worn military coat, his face turned slightly away from the camera. On the back of the photo, written in neat handwriting, were 5 words, "Still teaching them to survive." There was no signature, but the bottom corner was smudged, a faint crimson thumbprint. Stanton kept that photo locked in his desk until the day he died. When his family cleared his belongings, they found his journal written in trembling script. One page was underlined 3 times. The Red Ghost was not a myth. He was the conscience we buried. Across the channel, in a quiet corner of Normandy, an Englishman named Tom Keller worked as a caretaker at a ruined monastery. Locals said he was kind, quiet, and haunted. He taught village children how to read, how to make radios from scraps, and how to never forget the sound of truth. Every November 11th Armistice Day, he would walk to the cliffs at dawn, carrying a small wooden box and a single red poppy. He'd sit there for hours staring across the sea, as if waiting for ghosts to answer. One morning, a young boy named Etienne followed him. He watched as the old soldier opened the box, revealing an old British military medal, a photograph of a woman, Clara, and a folded page covered in faded handwriting. The boy asked, "Monsieur Keller, who were you in the war?" The man smiled faintly, his eyes carrying the weariness of centuries. "No one, my boy. Just someone who didn't want to forget." He handed the boy the folded page. "Keep this. If anyone asks what war makes of men, show them these words." Years later, that boy, Etienne Marchand, became a historian. And in 1951, while researching the archives of the Imperial War Museum in London, he stumbled upon a restricted file labeled Court Martial Private T. Keating Classified. Inside, he found transcripts of the secret trial, testimonies redacted, evidence removed, and an official note, subject executed, record sealed. But what caught his attention most was a small stain on the final page, a dried, reddish mark in the shape of a thumb. Etienne compared it with the letter he'd been given as a boy. It matched perfectly. He published his findings in a small academic journal titled The Ghost in the Trenches. The British government dismissed it as fiction, calling it a fanciful wartime myth. But veterans who read the article wrote letters, hundreds of them. Men who had fought at the Somme, at Arras, at Passchendaele, each swore they'd heard the stories too. Some claimed to have been saved by an anonymous warning. Others remembered seeing a flash of red in the night just before a German shell missed their trench. And slowly, the myth began to breathe again. By the 1960s, war museums across Europe began displaying personal letters and relics found in old battlefields. One exhibit, in Ypres, displayed a torn British field map with a single line scrawled in pencil, "Truth is worth dying for." The map bore a faint, almost invisible handprint, red like rust, pressed into the paper with deliberate force. A curator found it among artifacts donated by a local family, the descendants of a school teacher from Normandy. He never realized he was holding the last trace of Thomas Keating. But history, in its strange way, finds its justice. In 2014, a century after the Great War began, the British Ministry of Defense declassified thousands of old documents. Among them was a file marked Misca Confidential 1917. Inside, typed on yellowed paper, was a report from Colonel Frederick Stanton, never before seen. It read, "The individual known as Red Ghost provided intelligence that prevented the loss of the 12th Battalion and indirectly altered the course of the 1917 offensive. His name, Thomas Keating, was stricken from the record under pressure, from senior command due to political considerations. His actions, though unacknowledged, saved approximately 1,200 men. I hereby record this not as an officer, but as a witness. If history is ever fair, let his name be spoken again." That single document changed everything. The story made headlines across Britain. Newspapers called him the soldier who saved 1,000 lives. Documentaries, novels, and memorials followed. But what struck readers most dire was the closing line of the report, written in Stanton's own hand. He wrote history in blood because ink was too easy to erase. In 2018, during the centenary of the armistice, a ceremony was held at the Thiepval Memorial in France. Thousands gathered under the gray November sky as bagpipes echoed through the valley where the Somme once burned. Among the 72,000 names carved into the stone, names of men with no known graves, a new inscription was added that day at the base of the monument. Private Thomas Keating, 36th Ulster Division, executed in error, 1916, reinstated in honor, 2018. When the crowd fell silent, a single red poppy drifted from the wreath at the memorial's base and landed on the name. Some said it was the wind. Others swore they heard a whisper in the air, a low, tired voice that said, "Finally." But history never gives peace so easily. Later that evening, as the museum curator was closing the archives, he noticed something strange. On the wall beside the exhibit of the Red Ghost, where the blood-stained handkerchief hung in its glass case, there was a faint smear, as if someone had touched the glass from inside. It hadn't been there before. He leaned closer, and through the dim reflection of the museum lights, he saw what looked like a single fingerprint, fresh and red, pressed against the display. He stepped back, his heart pounding. The glass was unbroken. The room was empty. Outside, the night wind carried the sound of distant thunder, or perhaps it was the echo of artillery rolling across time. And somewhere beyond the reach of history books and monuments, a soldier walked again through the mist, his boots sinking into the mud of forgotten fields, his rifle slung across his back. He wasn't fighting anymore. He was remembering, because the dead never truly rest until the truth is spoken. And so long after his name had faded from the records, the legend remained, a ghost who defied kings, a man who fought not for glory or empire, but for the forgotten, the nameless, the betrayed, the soldier who wrote history in blood,